The underbelly of dressage saddle design, fashion and function. Welcome to this series on saddle design. I'm Ian Bitstrup, a spinal rehabilitation veterinarian who for 20 years was the lead presenter, instructor and manual editor for the accredited saddle fitters of Australasia. Enjoy. In part 4 we look closely at the ever-important front third of the underside of the saddle. The front of the saddle carries the weight transmitted by the stirrup bars. It carries the weight of the rider in 2-point or rising trot. It carries a third or more of the rider's seated weight. Tightening the girth pulls down on this area too, and especially does so if a 3-point girth attachment is used. So that's a billet towards the front of the saddle. That will really pull down onto the wither. Thus, there's a great need to spread the pressure over as large an area as possible through this wither region of the horse. Also, it's very important to minimise the vector of inward pressure that's being directed against the muscle lying just lateral or beside the bone of the vertebrae, the dorsal spinous process of the vertebrae of the wither. It's important too that the front of the saddle does not interfere with the shoulder blade movement. So when we design the front, we've got to make it comfortable for a horse to stretch out in front. For a horse to extend its leg forward comfortably, the upper part of the scapula or shoulder blade must have the freedom to move back beneath the saddle as it does. This movement of the shoulder blade under the saddle is facilitated by the fact that the cartilage top of the shoulder blade is angular and will slip under the saddle readily in most cases. The front section of the saddle should not be so hard or as rigid as to block the movement of the scapula underneath the saddle itself. If the saddle is positioned too far forward and is jammed up against or on top of the shoulder blade, it can damage the scapular cartilage as well as the often sensitive origin of the serratus ventralis thoracis muscle. This portion of the upper part of the serratus ventralis muscle that attaches to the bone here seems to be prone to pain that is probably associated with strain of the muscle attachment here. The cartilage itself is not able to sustain pressure for a long period of time. If this part of the serratus ventralis is tight, then often it will produce trigger points underneath the latissimus dorsi in this area, creating a bulge in this area that's quite sensitive, and the saddle coming over the top of that can be a real problem too. One of the reasons that the saddle needs to be comfortable in this area is because dysfunction often affects this region of the spine and also the girth, and so any soreness in those areas is going to stop the horse being able to stretch out its front leg properly, because the muscles of the skin in this area will tighten and get overly sensitized, and these muscles will tighten, including the long head of the triceps, and that will restrict foreleg protraction. Thus, for best performance, the saddle and girth combination must be gentle on these areas, the girth and the wither area. We'll talk more about that shortly. Common options for the front of the saddle, and this is one that particularly affects the spinalis thoracis muscle of the horse. Short tree points are one of the biggest ones that affect this area. This is a very fashionable option in saddles at the moment, with the idea that the saddle is not going to stop the shoulder blade moving backwards, and I think it's an ill-founded idea, in that the more comfortable we keep the withers, the more the horse is going to be able to stretch out in front. If we use short tree points to support that heavy pressure through the front of the saddle, then we're going to create significant pressure on the withers, which has an adverse impact on the overly sensitive spinalis thoracis muscle and the multifidus muscles deep to this tree point. Although the shorter tree points are thought to have less impact on the shoulder blade retraction compared to longer ones, they spread the load of the rider and the girth over a smaller area, which may increase the shear strain and pressure on one of the most sensitive areas affected by the saddle. Based on my observation, horses that are ridden for an extended period in saddles with short tree points often display noticeably more discomfort in their withers than those that are equipped with longer tree points, and they tend to show a greater limitation of the protraction of their forelegs when they're working. So if we look at the opposite situation with long tree points, long and broad ones are what you want, and this picture doesn't show it very well. This saddle, the tree point and the panel combination effectively acts from here through to here, so it's quite a big support for the front of the saddle. It's getting support from the actual stirrup bar as well. I'd like to see more support through this area here so the panels work even better, but that's another matter. But at least it allows that these panels aren't positioned too high. With short tree points too, we're really stuck with having the panels fairly high on the actual tree very often, and so that's coming up high into the wither, and with these angular withers can come right up against the area that's going to put pressure on to that spinalis thoracis muscle as well. As a side, having panels that rise high up into the gullet is crucial for activities where the horse may navigate turns very quickly, such as chasing stock or chasing a cow or jumping the horse. The design that comes up into the wither like this enhances the saddle stability by optimizing the clamping effect of the saddle gullet. The negative pressure effects of this clamping action can be helped a great deal too if the jumping saddles are only used for very active riding and avoided being used for slower hacking. So when it comes to stock saddles here in this country, they certainly give better stability on turns to come up high into the gullet, but invariably we see muscle loss through the wither area as a result of these clamping saddles, and we see deterioration of the horse's back as a result. And this is very commonly seen in stock horses out in the outback here in Australia and in the big stations, and I don't think it's realised well enough that the cause is actually that high pressure so often. If we could drop the pressure down, we would have a much better situation, because there's a lot of time in those stock saddles spent at a slower speed, and that causes quite a considerable amount of damage to the horse's wither area and back, and the whole back deteriorates as a result. If we have nice low placement of the panels and you need nice long tree points to allow this, then I find horses are usually much more comfortable and they can handle longer, slower rides where the pressure is much more statically set over their back. It's not perfect, but it's much more comfortable in these short, high tree points that are pressing in and clamping onto the sensitive muscles of the upper spine, and the muscles that have less sort of damping effect of more muscle between them and the bone. And just to show it on the wither, high up in the wither is going to come closer into the spinalis thoracis muscle, is sitting here against the bone. It's going to be clamped against the bone. It's going to have restricted blood flow in most cases where there's not really active motion happening. The pressure is supposed to be something like 3 to 5 times higher at the bone surface than it is at the skin surface. In these situations in humans and pigs where they've experimented on similar sort of situations, let's not do that to our horses if we can help it. By moving the pressure further down, and this is exaggerated of course, moving it further down, we've got much more horizontal support from the rib, and the horse is going to be a lot more comfortable with that downward pressure, and any inward pressure has got a much bigger buffer for it. Another option for the front of the saddle is how much padding you have here and how much support you have for that padding. We've talked about the support. The actual amount of padding varies in certain saddles. Some manufacturers thought it was a good idea to actually cut back this area so that the shoulder blade can move under here more easily. The trouble is this hugely reduces the support over the tree point where it's desperately needed. We don't want to just be sitting this bit onto the upper part of the wither. We want to be actually supporting this whole area better through here, not cutting things back where it's a crucial part. This area carries far too much weight. So I would advise against anything that looks like that. And there is a case for it, but not for 99% of horses. You will notice that in some saddles the panels are quite thin and some are fatter. These are called gusseted panels, where there's an extra bit of leather added and more ability to put flock. This is a thin, close contact one, so the horse and the saddle tree are going to be matched beautifully, and the horse isn't allowed to have any muscle atrophy or this won't work. This one will enable you to fill some holes of muscle atrophy and support the saddle better with flock. This one gives you limited options, just like so many of the foam tree saddles do. This is another option that gives more support through this region here. So this is a regular panel through the tree point area, and this is a drop panel or a trapezius front panel. This sadly doesn't work as well as we might like to think it will do, because it's poorly supported by the tree itself. It's just supported by the flat. So it's an improvement, but doesn't actually necessarily function that well. If we supported this panel better from above with some more rigid sort of material above it, we'd have a totally different situation. And this is another drop panel, and it certainly fills the space, spreads the load a bit better, but is not that effective unless the tree sits over it well and supports it well. To make this panel work well, the saddlers have to be careful to firm up the inner layers of this flock and just leave a nice soft layer on the body surface of the panel. If it's really soft through there, then the saddle will just drop too much in front and not work so well. Quilting is another option for the saddle, and it's used by some of the high-class saddleries, and it is something that normally should be left in place because it stabilizes the flock and also helps firm up the panel through this area. So even though the panel's not extra supported by anything stiff above it, the actual quilting stiffens this region of the panel. So it improves the function of the panel in my view, and can be an advantage in certain horses. In part 5, we look closely at the middle or waist portion of the saddle and the portion under the rider's seat. See you there.